justice is what we need when righteousness is absent. So we don't always do the right thing. So then we need justice. God is a God of righteousness, determining and declaring what is right. God is also a God of justice, who shows up when righteousness isn't there.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we could make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and a review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you're new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Lisa Sharon Harper, Brenda Salter McNeil, and Jonathan Tremaine Thomas. You can go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Jemar Tisby. Jemar Tisby is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Color of Compromise: How to Fight Racism, Young Readers Edition, and his latest, The Spirit of Justice. He is also a professor of history at Simmons College of Kentucky in Louisville. Jemar has been a co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast since its inception 7 years ago. His writing has been featured in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, and the New York Times, among others. He is a frequent commentator on outlets such as NPR and CNN's New Day program. He speaks nationwide on the topics of racial justice, U.S. history, and Christianity. Jemar earned his PhD in history, and he studies race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. Jemar Tisby takes us through the rich history of Black Christians fighting for justice in America, from Phillis Wheatley's powerful poetry to the legal strategy that toppled Jim Crow. Tisby highlights how the spirit of justice has driven Black Christians to resist oppression and work towards greater freedom. He emphasizes the crucial distinction between slaveholder Christianity and the true Christianity of Christ, which compels us to love our neighbor. Tisby stresses the importance of maintaining a smoke detector mentality, staying vigilantly engaged in the ongoing struggle for justice. Ultimately, Tisby's message is one of hope and inspiration. By studying the stories of those who have gone before, we can tap into that same spirit of justice and keep moving the needle toward a more righteous and equitable society. So join us as we tap into that same spirit of justice. Here is my conversation with Jemar Tisby. Jemar, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
I love it. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to dig into your book, The Spirit of Justice. It's a fantastic historical survey of Black Christians rising up with the spirit of justice, moving the needle in like the way that we actually treat Black Americans in a way that we could actually look at fair and equitable treatment for all people, which would be fantastic. Let's move the needle. Let's continue to do this and this work. I love it. The spirit of justice for you, where did you first come about that phrase and why did it resonate for you?
Sometimes I really struggle with how to start a writing project, like what the beginning will be. This was not one of those projects. I knew immediately where I would begin. And the introduction is a story about Myrlie Evers Williams, the widow of Medgar Evers, but a civil rights activist in her own right. And in December 2017, the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum had its grand opening. And there was a press conference afterwards that I was able to gain access to. And a journalist in that press conference asked her, well, how does now in the 21st century compare to what you experienced in the civil rights movement as far as justice? And she said, I'm seeing things now that I hope I never see again. And she said, I'm weary. But then she said, but there's something about the spirit of justice. And that just that combination of words, spirit of justice, it stuck with me ever since then. And I circled back to it. And I'm like, yes, that's it. As you look throughout history, you see in the actions of people who rose up for justice, the spirit of justice internally driving and motivating them. So I was like, oh man, that is not only a great phrase, but that'll be a great story to start a book out.
I mean, you get into that space, and I think, you have the spirit of justice that drives you and inside of you. And I know that there has been some opposition that has come your way, just a little bit. And
just a little bit.
I'm sure you're probably weary at times as well. What makes you continue with the spirit of justice?
So I actually think when the opposition is the strongest, in a certain way, it's the easiest to continue because the mission is clear. The obstacles are clear. The spirit of justice is rowdy within you. You want to push back against dehumanization and indignity and all of those things. I think the spirit of justice is hardest to maintain when things appear peaceful. And it's an illusion of peace, right? Because we still have so much work to do. But at the same time, what I tell people is justice isn't a task list. It's not an agenda item to check off and move on. Justice is a disposition. It's a habit of mind and thought and attitudes that you have to maintain. And I contrast it with, in my second book, How to Fight Racism, I talk about a smoke alarm, a light switch versus a smoke detector. A light switch is something that you turn on and off. And a lot of times people treat racial justice like a light switch. When there's a racist incident, when there's another cell phone video, when there's a headline or a politician makes a gaffe, light switch goes on. As soon as that headline changes, as soon as life gets busy, whatever, that light switch goes off. What we really need to be is more like smoke detectors. A smoke detector isn't effective unless it's always on, unless it's always sensitive for danger and risk. And that's more of the attitude that I think we need to cultivate when it comes to the spirit of justice.
Oh, that's a great thing. It's always on. We're looking for that. So then what is justice? I mean, people have different definitions of justice, and they're moving in different directions. And then what are the different ways that we could enact justice?
That is a critical question. I mean, it seems so simple, right? What is justice? It's along with like, what is racism, right? Like we talk about these things, but we seldom pause to define them. So I'm grateful you asked that question. And I'm grateful I just preached a sermon on it so I could maybe give you a pre-thought answer. I not contrasted, but I put in conversation justice with righteousness. So if you, in the Bible, justice and righteousness often go together. And I'm like, well, are they synonyms? Are they different? And in my view, they are related but distinct. So righteousness is simply that which is right. God orders the world according to a certain vision of what it means to treat others the way they ought to be treated. You can find this in distillations like the Ten Commandments or the Beatitudes, right? That's a picture of righteousness. Justice is what we need when righteousness is absent. Justice is what we need when righteousness is absent. So we don't always do the right thing. So then we need justice. God is a God of righteousness, determining and declaring what is right. God is also a God of justice, who shows up when righteousness isn't there. And that has both positive and negative concepts, right? So in the positive sense, justice is people getting what they deserve as human beings. that's food, shelter, clothing, a reasonable chance at a life full of joy and fulfilling work and all of those kinds of things, the basics of what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God. Everybody deserves that. And to the extent that they don't get it, they deserve that as justice, right? But there's also justice in a somewhat negative sense of the consequences for wrongdoing. So if you are the agent of injustice, if you are the agent of unrighteousness, then you also deserve justice in the form of accountability. So that's where I think, we can think about justice as people getting what they deserve, and justice that which is necessary when righteousness is absent.
Yeah, that's important. You talk a little bit of distinctions of how we engage those things. So you have three: you have resistance, you have activism, awareness. What are these ways to actually engage some of these justice issues so that we could move the needle towards what is right and righteous?
So the way I structure the book is, again, as a historical survey. So if folks are familiar with my first book, The Color of Compromise, that was similar. I focus in the spirit of justice on more individuals and their stories and their actions. And I wanted to think of some way of how to explain the breadth of people and kind of work that they did. Because I think when we think of justice and when we think of activism, we have in mind the more overt, external, public-facing, spectacular in the sense of spectacle kind of actions, the marches, the protests, the boycotts, the sit-ins. That's all protest. That's all justice, right? But that's not all. So in the introduction of the book, I talk about different forms of justice, and it's resistance, advocacy, activism. So resistance is like whatever you do to find joy and try to flourish in a world that is bent against you. So in the United States, when we're dealing with white supremacy, anything that Black people do to assert our humanity is resistance. And so that can be having a family, that can be making music or writing poetry or you name it, right? And here's the thing with resistance, it's not always conscious that you're doing it, right? You're not necessarily, when you get a good night's sleep and you wake up feeling rested, you're not necessarily doing that to stick it to the man. You're just doing that for your survival. But it is resistance because your rest, your well-being is not something that's valued in certain communities and societies, right? So that's resistance. But there's also advocacy. Advocacy is intentional. It's about amplifying and building awareness and supporting. So I think a lot of us were catalyzed, whether in 2016 with the Black Lives Matter movement or 2020 with the racial justice uprisings, and we wanted to be part of the solution. So we started sharing posts, reading books, hosting book clubs, doing talks, sermons, whatever. That's all advocacy. And often advocacy is in support of other organizations, other individuals that are doing the front lines work. And that's what leads to, I think, activism. That's the more traditional thing that we have in mind when we think of justice and resistance is these. So these are the folks on the front lines, the community organizers, the nonprofit leaders, the activists, the folks who are, literally often risking their freedom because they might get arrested or, their bodily safety, putting their bodies on the line for justice. They show up in the places, they shout, they lead, all of those kinds of things. That's activism too. But, the spirit of justice covers that spectrum and that array.
That's fantastic. I'd love to get into some of these stories in your historical survey. And to do that, I want to set something up. I want to read a little bit of Mark 4 in the Message version. Eugene Peterson says something that in the parable of the soils, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, why do you tell stories? And so Jesus says this in the Message to his disciples: you've been given insight into God's kingdom. You know how it works. But to those who can't see it yet, everything comes in stories, creating readiness, nudging them toward receptive insight. And I think this is what stories do for us. They create readiness to receive the truth of the kingdom of God so that we could actually open our eyes and see something totally different than if we just said, racism is bad, stop doing it. We wouldn't be able to see it, right? And so this is what I love about the stories. We were coming back from Louisville. I know we were in Louisville last week. We were coming back. We stopped at the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, and they have this fantastic museum now. And one of the things that struck me is that they talked about coming from the Gateway into the West, and they told the story of this man named George Bush. He was a mixed race, a Black American. His father was Black, his mother was white, Irish. And so he came with his family to Oregon, and Oregon set up this whole system and said, if there are any free Black people in our state, we're going to kick them out. And so he had this huge journey and got kicked out of the state that he arrived in right away with the rest of his family, who's white. And so his family went with him. And so this one story, there's this burning in my heart, like, who are we? Why do we do this? But if they just said, like, hey, Oregon had this law, I would have been, oh, that's too bad. So these stories are important. And what you do here is really important to move the needle. So I'd love to go just back into the Revolutionary era. You talk about this poet, Phillis Wheatley, young African-American woman. Who is she? And what was she doing? How did she have the spirit of justice in her?
Phillis Wheatley, such an interesting historical figure because she's caught between these worlds of she's Black, she's taken straight from Africa as a young girl, but she's enslaved in New England. And so the contours of slavery look different region to region, colony to colony. And in the New England, they didn't have, these big fields for planting tobacco or cotton or anything. So a lot of times enslavement looked like domestic service, domestic labor. And so she's in close proximity with white people and is learning from them. One of the things that she learns is how to read and write, which is very rare, but she's a precocious child, very quick to pick up on things. And she's reading things like Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad and all these things, stuff that I can't even keep up with, right? And she's reading the Bible too, very deeply. And one of the things that intrigued me about Phillis Wheatley is she becomes a poet, and she's so good as a poet and publishes a book of poetry with the help of some folks in Britain who raised money to publish it. Her writing's so good that white people in the U.S. can't believe that a Black girl wrote this. like they actually get together and have a meeting and basically interrogate her to see if she's smart enough and good enough with words to have actually written it, and there wasn't some ghostwriter or something, right? And she proves to them that, yeah, she did it. And they come away saying, oh my gosh, this woman's amazing, right? And she writes this, her most well-known poem is on being brought from Africa to America. And it's so interesting because she sounds this note that slaveholders often say, well, it's good. The good thing about slaveholding is at least enslaved Africans heard the gospel. If they had stayed in Africa, they would have remained pagans and they would have gone to hell. So, and as a matter of fact, slavery was good for them, right? And that actually comes across. There's a note of that in that poem by Phillis Wheatley. She's expressing gratitude for hearing the gospel in the circumstances that she did. But at the same time, she's saying that Black people have dignity. And in her other poems, in her other works, she's expressing a longing for freedom. So I just was really taken in by her story of what it must be like to learn religion, to learn Christianity from slaveholders and racists and white supremacists, to maybe even absorb some of that messaging and language, but also to know deep down in her, which I think was the spirit of justice speaking within her and coming out through her pen, that she deserved freedom, that she deserved equality. And so I just think, poetry has this unique way of expressing profound thoughts in very concise terms. And you can see that in the marvelous, brilliant poetry of Phillis Wheatley.
And it goes all the way up. Just to the side, we saw Amanda Gorman stand up at the inauguration of Joe Biden and giving an incredible poem at the poetry.
She stole the show.
She stole the show.
Inauguration.
And it's still happening today, right? This poetry, this imagination, creativity that is happening. You write in your book, Wheatley stands as an early voice in a long tradition of Black artists who use their creativity to imagine new worlds, argue for greater rights, elevate humanity in a way that only true beauty can do. So give me some more examples of what does imagination, creativity, and beauty do to move justice issues into a place of closer to righteousness. All Nations Kansas City has 2 exciting events with Jamie and Donna Winship coming up. Join us on September 13th for our annual fundraiser, Furthered Together, with Jamie and Donna as our main speakers. Did you know that God is on the move all around the world? You will hear stories about people receiving their true identity from God and impacting nations. And you will be invited to join us so that more stories like these can happen and we can see peace in the midst of conflict. The following day, September 14th, Jamie and Donna will be doing their identity exchange workshop. Join us to discover your true identity and experience a life of joy, peace, and freedom. You can register for both events at allnations.us.
There is so much art that is justice or goes along with justice. You can think of the Black homiletical tradition as art. Have you ever heard a really skilled preacher in the Black preaching style? It is painting pictures with words. It is using analogies and metaphors. And I really think it's in the pattern of Jesus's use of parables and imagery that his listeners would understand. There is an actual historical basis for the Black homiletical tradition in that this was a population of people that historically, by and large, were barred from formal education. So they didn't have a lot of readers, they didn't have a lot of writers. And what preachers would have to do is paint pictures with words that people who didn't have a formal education could understand. So they got really good at comparing, lofty theological ideas about a transcendent God to really down to earth images and pictures that people. So that's a form of art. I think creativity and imagination come through in all kinds of ways. I think of Charles Hamilton Houston, who really should be much more well-known than he is. He was the architect of the legal strategy that brought down Jim Crow. So we think of Thurgood Marshall arguing the Brown v. Board of Education decision and, winning that case that made it illegal to discriminate legally based on race. It was Charles Hamilton Houston who thought of lawyers as social engineers, by which he meant you should use the law to make society better and not just for your own personal gain. So he teaches at Howard University Law School. It becomes the premier law school of any HBCU. He is mentoring and educating people like Thurgood Marshall, first Black Supreme Court Justice. And then the NAACP recruits him to head up their legal strategy for working against segregation. And then he comes up with, okay, let's go back to Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. They essentially enshrine into law the policy of separate but equal. But as everybody knew, Black and white, separate was never equal. So Hamilton says, creative mind working on a legal strategy, architecting this, crafting this. He says, let's go after that clause, separate but equal. And let's bring cases to the courts that say, you said it was going to be separate and equal, but here's a student who wants to major in music. The only colleges open to them as a Black person don't have music majors, and there's none in the state. So it's not equal. It's not even the same offering. Or here's the school building, and here's what's offered at the white school, and here's what's offered at the Black school, and it's not equal. And that's how they were able to build cases that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, Hamilton dies in 1950, so he doesn't see the Brown v. Board of Education decision, but it was his legal strategy and his creativity and imagination to come up with that legal strategy that eventually brought the court case that toppled Jim Crow.
It's important to see that. And it's important to see that we can actually imagine a better future. We can imagine a place that we can join Jesus in the redemption and reconciliation of all things. And there can be a place where heaven does come to earth. Like we're praying the Lord's Prayer every day. God, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so this is what we're fighting for on a daily basis. Like we want to see heaven on earth. And I know that there's a long history within the Christian tradition of fighting for justice, because Jesus is justice. We're moving them forward. I know you write in your section on the abolitionist era, you write this. You said, throughout the abolitionist era in U.S. history, Christians argued and acted in opposition to slaveholder Christianity. Their efforts to eradicate race-based chattel slavery arose in spite of their Christian faith, not because of it. So what does this Christian faith that we hold, that we have, help enable this spirit of justice? And what are the tenets of the faith that make us move towards that aim?
So I think the crucial part there is distinguishing between slaveholder Christianity and the Christianity of Christ. So this is, of course, language that comes from Frederick Douglass, who, by the way, talk about stories. He puts this in the appendix to one of his 3 autobiographies, which I think is wild, right? Can you imagine writing 3 life stories of your own life? But, he was not necessarily a humble man. But he puts this in the appendix of his first autobiography. And it's so interesting. Like, he writes this as an addendum because he feels some type of way that he's written this entire autobiography, and almost every mention of Christianity has been in the context of how badly white Christians were living out their religion. And so he gets to the end of his autobiography and he's like, you know what? I don't want people to get the wrong impression. I'm not against religion. I'm not against Christianity. So let me make it clear here in this appendix. And that's when he writes, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide as to receive the one as good and pure and holy is of necessity, to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. So that's the distinguishing mark here. And what abolitionists are doing is seeing that distinction between slaveholder Christianity and the Christianity of Christ. And they're arguing from the same Bible with pro-slavery apologists that, no, loving your neighbor as yourself precludes slaveholding and slave trading. Like that's the two do not go together. Meanwhile, pro-slavery advocates are arguing from the very same Bible that, well, the Bible doesn't explicitly condemn slavery, and so if God didn't want it there, he'd outlaw it. And so there's this battle, not just of bullets, but a battle over the Bible too. And what abolitionists are doing is saying that the gospel is fundamentally a movement from less freedom to greater freedom. And even though we see slavery in the Bible, first of all, it takes a very different form in U.S. race-based chattel slavery, and second of all, how do you live out the great commandment to love God and then to love your neighbor, and certainly enslaving people and preventing their freedom can't be very loving.
Yeah, I mean, you just said it. Like we're moving from less freedom to greater freedom, and we're still in this move today. Like if you in the United States, like it wasn't that long ago when the Civil War happened, and Like it it wasn't that long ago.
Uh-uh.
And so there's remnants of things in here today. So take me into the Civil War era. After the Civil War, some people that maybe we don't know as well. Like, I mean, I know like the story of Harriet Tubman. We go into the civil rights movement. We know Martin Luther King Jr. Take me into some stories that are less well known, but have moved the needle from less freedom to greater freedom.
Yeah, and you talking about the Civil War not that long ago. Not only is it not that long ago, it's also the United States is a young nation, relatively speaking. So all of the history is sort of more impactful because there's less history in general, right? To think about. So that was just another thought that occurred to me as you brought that up, and thinking about sort of lesser known figures from the Civil War era. I think of H. Ford Douglass. H. Ford Douglass, no relation to Frederick. He was a biracial black man who his father was his enslaver, who was so light-skinned that he could have passed for white, and he did. But whereas most black people who passed for white were doing it to gain comfort and literally white privilege, H. Ford Douglass passed as white so he could enlist in the Union Army before they allowed black people to enlist. He wanted to fight for freedom, and he was willing to use his light-skinned appearance to get into the Union Army. And he does so. And as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, January 1st, 1863, most people recognize it as the proclamation of freedom for certain people in the rebellious states. But it also authorized black people to join the Union Army. So as soon as that went into effect, H. Ford Douglass was like, I'm black, and gets permission to raise his own unit of all black soldiers and becomes one of, if not the first, black officer in charge of his own black troops. Usually it was a white officer in charge of black troops. So he does all of this at great risk to himself. And his story to me is just astounding because he takes on this risk for a country that had no love for him or his people, and chooses to fight anyway. That to me really exemplifies the spirit of justice. You mentioned Harriet Tubman before. Everybody knows her name, Underground Railroad, but she freed in one night hundreds more people than all of her trips on the Underground Railroad combined. And that was her leading the Combahee River raid. So Tubman, by this time in the Civil War, has gained a reputation. She wants to help the Union. And so she gets various assignments. And eventually she basically becomes kind of like a spy or informant of sorts. She uses her knowledge of the South because she's been in and out. And she knows all the secret doors and all that stuff. And she uses her ability to talk to enslaved people without them running away in fright. If a white person, even a Union officer or soldier is talking to a black person, number one, it's highly likely that that Union soldier is racist themselves. But also, black folk can't trust white people, especially under these circumstances. But Harriet Tubman could talk to them. So anyway, she gathers all this information and enough information that one night, the Union leads a raid on the Combahee River, and it's in the middle of the night. It's a surprise raid, and they sound these horns, and black enslaved people come rushing to the river to get on these boats, but it's chaotic. People don't know if they can trust, what's happening. Nobody knows where to go, who to follow. Harriet Tubman raises her voice. I think she starts singing. She calms everybody down, and according to records, somewhere around 700 enslaved people that one night escape into freedom. And so it's Harriet Tubman as a Civil War leader, and she's got military honors. She can be buried in Arlington Cemetery. So it's really remarkable aspect of a life of a figure who seems to be well known, but what she did far exceeds, what we generally talk about.
It's so amazing. I just even I like the movie Harriet with Cynthia Erivo was going through my mind when that was like Cynthia Erivo has a beautiful voice. So when she started singing in that scene too that you just described,
yes.
it's a beautiful part of that movie, which I love. After the Civil War, we're Black people had freedom, started to start some Black institutions, started to build something then for themselves to move the needle forward. Who were these people that were building these institutions, and what did those institutions do for the spirit of Black Americans?
So I was trying to figure out how to write about the Jim Crow era, because there's a lot of not good stuff going on. It's the era of lynching. It's the era of the rebirth of the KKK. It's the era of the film Birth of a Nation. All of these things are going on, and I'm trying to characterize what does Black resistance look like in this era. And it struck me that one of the first things that Black people did upon emancipation was start building their own institutions, whether it was banks, schools, churches. This is really when we talk about historic Black whatever, it probably came about in that period of what we call the Jim Crow era. So there's this intense racial terrorism happening and this entrenchment of a new manifestation of white supremacy post-emancipation. But at the same time, Black people are building. So I work at Simmons College of Kentucky. It's a historically Black college founded in 1879. A group of Black Baptist ministers got together right after the Civil War and said, we need to educate our people. We need a faith-based higher education institution. Took them over a decade to gather enough funds and enough people and enough students to get started, and they did. And it's named after William J. Simmons, who was the college's second president, who was a pastor, but oftentimes these guys were just so multi-talented. So he could preach and expound on the Bible, but he was also an institution builder, a fundraiser. He knew politics, all of these things. And so was able to build it up into this remarkable institution that has this very long history, including the devastation of the Depression, where they lost all of their property. But then in the 1990s, St. Stephen Church, pastored by Dr. Kevin W. Cosby, who's now the president of Simmons College, they were able to buy back the original property. And it's the only story we know of an HBCU that lost its original property, like its whole campus, and was able to buy it back. And there's one more aspect of that story. I mean, there's a ton, but one more that I'll mention is the buildings. It was essentially the plantation house. The slaveholders lived there and eventually sold it, and it was this Black school that bought the property. So on the same grounds where Black people were enslaved, Black people are now liberated through education.
What a beautiful redemption story. I mean, that's so amazing to take something that was meant for evil to then change it and bring it into something that is made for good.
Precisely.
Amazing. It's so good. Moving in through, the civil rights era, which, man, this, it's closer to our era now. So we're getting to this place where, for me, like, even though I wasn't born yet, it feels more current. Like this is, and it gets me inspired. Martin Luther King Jr. inspires me. His wife, Coretta Scott King, inspires me to live out the spirit of justice. What were Black Christians doing during that time of the civil rights era to really embody the spirit of justice, to move the needle in place of, again, greater freedom?
The civil rights era is where the Black freedom struggle goes public. So historians often talk about the long Black freedom struggle or even the long civil rights movement. And what they're trying to do there is emphasize the continuity. So what we're seeing in the civil rights movement, the marches, the boycotts, the protests, that's not brand new. And a matter of fact, a lot of the strategies and tactics were developed in the 1930s and 40s as part of the labor union movement. This is in the shadow and the wake of the Great Depression, where workers are organizing for fair wages and the 40-hour work week and weekends off and greater rights in general. And they're utilizing these tactics that then get recycled in the civil rights movement to fight for Black civil and political rights. So it's part of that continuity, but I say it goes public because media has part to do with it, right? You have newspaper and radio, but now you're getting film and television and cameras and journalists going out, and what they're doing is exposing particularly the repression in the South to white folks in the North, right? So Black folks knew this even in the North because they were probably internal refugees from the South escaping racial terrorism, but white people didn't realize this. And so once they do, and these pictures start coming out in protest, that's when it goes public. And it's a coalescing of a lot of different things. Every single time when you see someone like an MLK or his Southern Christian Leadership Conference come into a city, there's already an infrastructure in place. So for instance, 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, there was already something called the Montgomery Improvement Association dedicated to Black civil rights. In Birmingham, there was already infrastructure there, partially led by Fred Shuttlesworth and others that he could latch on to, and others could latch on to start building a movement. Now, some new organizations came up, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was, student-led, very dynamic. Ella Baker's influence, and the spirit of justice is showing up in really pushing for voting rights and desegregation. So what's happening in the civil rights movement is you see the end of the era we call Jim Crow, which is legalized racial segregation. Segregation still exists in various forms and baked into the laws, but this sort of explicit, whites only, blacks not allowed, that comes tumbling down through Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, things of that nature. And also you get to see, I think, the flowering of the Black church as a heart and a hub for activism and justice as well.
There any voices at that time that came out of the Black church that produced some activism and justice?
Yeah, so many. I actually have a whole chapter on Martin Luther King called Beyond the Quotable King. There's a lot more to learn about Martin Luther King Jr. than just his bus boycott and the I Have a Dream speech. But then there's a whole chapter on Black women of the civil rights movement. And so there's many people. I talk about Coretta Scott King. She has this great line in her autobiography. She says, there is a Mrs. King. There's also Coretta. How one became detached from the other remains a mystery to me. So in other words, she's saying, I was my own person before Martin, right? Before this little short dude, dapper dressed, married me. And so she really it becomes a global human rights activist, worthy of study and admiration in her own right. I include folks like Ruby Dee, the actress, right? She was married to Ossie Davis. She had a remarkable career, really trailblazing on stage and on screen. And she's one of the MCs of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So here's an example of a Black person who's made it in the arts, which is incredibly hard to do for any artist, let alone a Black artist in the civil rights era, right? And she's risking it all and putting it all on the line by being politically active and outspoken about social justice. So I just think that's a spirit of justice there, where you have a lot of celebrities, even today, who, because they don't want to risk their platform or popularity, won't speak on issues of justice. You have so many, like Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who many people don't know, but she was critical in the YWCA and the National Council of Churches, and she headed up the Commission on Religion and Race, and she was one of the organizers of the March on Washington, strongly advocated for women to be a bigger part of the March on Washington. And even though she wasn't successful in that, she was a voice that was so necessary. So there are just too many to name, but that was one of the most thrilling chapters for me to research and to write. Is just like, let's focus on women who were the backbone of the movement, but oftentimes didn't get the recognition they deserved.
Amazing. I want everybody to go out and read it. Go read The Spirit of Justice and that chapter on Black women in the civil rights movement. Fantastic. I love that chapter. That chapter was awesome for me to be able to get to know some of these women. How can you talked earlier about being a smoke detector and not a light switch? So how can we continually stay on? What are we detecting now in today's age that we need to be a smoke detector? And when the smoke is coming, the alarm goes off. What are we looking for? What is happening? What is racial injustice at the moment in today's world?
That's good. So first of all, for any non-Black person, if you want like Black racial justice to be part of your life and part of your disposition and have this smoke detector mentality, you have to be in proximity with Black people. More generally, you have to be in proximity to the oppressed. Otherwise, you won't know their issues, much less care about them. So there's no real way to stay aware and to stay active in the movement for justice if you're not near people who are crying out for justice. So that's the first thing. And then I think sort of the crux of justice issues today focuses around the threat of white Christian nationalism. I call white Christian nationalism the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. Because why are people turning away from the faith? It's not because we care too much about people. It's not because we're too loving. It's not because we're too socially and justice involved. It's because we're not enough of those things. It's because there's a presentation of a kind of Christianity, a kind of way of doing religion that is rigid and narrow and exclusive and authoritarian and patriarchal and sexist and racist. And that's what people are seeing. And they're like, I don't want any part of it. And I don't blame you. And it's a form of an ideology that is trying to subvert the will of the people in order to gain power in the political realm. So it's sort of this pervasive threat in the church and beyond. And one of the ways that I think we push back against that is by studying other ways of holding on to faith. Particularly other ways of engaging faith in politics, which the Black Christian tradition is a powerful example of, right? Because many Black ministers were politicians, many Black civil rights activists who were Christians were advocating for greater democracy and expansion of democracy. Senator Raphael Warnock is, literally occupying the same pulpit at Ebenezer Baptist Church that Martin Luther King Jr. did and is now a U.S. senator, right? So we can see the ways different Christians have thought about power and faith and politics and know that there's more beyond white Christian nationalism.
I just read a Facebook post from somebody today said he got some feedback that the Black church in the South is like Black Christian nationalism dealing with politics. And can you distinguish then? So just distinguish what is white Christian nationalism, and then how do we faithfully engage politics as believers, as Christians?
So in saying equating,
right?
Right.
But
so it sounds like this person is equating white Christian nationalism and Black Christian nationalism. The fundamental error is that these two have different ends. First of all, put on the historian hat for a moment. There is a thing called Black Christian nationalism. Someone I write about in The Spirit of Justice is named Albert Clegg Jr., pastor in Detroit. He renames his church Shrine of the Black Madonna, and he unveils this huge mural inside the church of an African-looking Mother Mary holding her child, baby Jesus, who's also Black, right? And he writes a book literally called Black Christian Nationalism, arguing for greater Black self-determination, the nationalism part, as an outgrowth and an application of Christianity. So there is an actual kind of theological strain of Black Christian nationalism. But again, the ends are different. I think what this person is calling Black Christian nationalism is not even Black Christian nationalism. It's Black folks, thinking through politics via the lens of their faith, right? And the ends are different. Traditionally, when Black folks get involved in politics as Christians, it leads to an expansion of voting rights, an expansion of participation, an expansion of democracy. What's good for Black people getting involved in citizenship, which they've historically been denied, is good for all people. And white Christian nationalism is just the opposite. It wants to pull us back to a time when wealthy white men held sway, where they didn't have to listen to or be criticized or pay attention to other voices, other perspectives, or other people also having power. And so this false equivalency is just a poison pill in our democracy, that things that look similar in terms of their actions, whether voting or talking about politicians or whatever it might be, they're equated in a way that is really unhelpful and oftentimes just disingenuous. And so we got to be able to discern, what's the telos of these movements, and, what is the motive behind them as well.
That's really helpful. I think that's going to be, I think some people come into it and I don't really know what the ends are. And I think that's a really important distinction. What is the ultimate end game for people? And so I like that, because then I could be like a smoke detector. I could say, oh, this is the ultimate end game over here. This is the ultimate end game over here. This I could call good. This I could say, this is evil. We got to get rid of it. So that's really helpful. So can you talk to your readers, the people that would pick up your book, The Spirit of Justice, read through this? What do you hope that your readers would get out of your book?
One of the motivations for writing the book was to answer that question: is Christianity the white man's religion? Because we've seen Christianity used and abused so often to create or perpetuate racial harm. It's a valid question. Is there something inherent to it that's racist or unhelpful in the cause of justice? And what this book says is, actually, there's something different we can expect from Christianity. When we look at the Black Christian tradition, when we look at how historically marginalized and oppressed people think about the faith, you get a very different picture of Christianity, one that is liberative and expansive and hope-filled and inspirational. And that's the second goal of this book that I hope readers walk away with is, y'all, we are in this for the long haul. I think after 2020, there was this brief glimmer where even corporations were getting in on it and saying, yeah, we should really make progress in this intractable problem of racism. And then just as soon as the calendar flipped over from 2020 to 2021, you get an attempted insurrection and you get this massive backlash, anti-CRT, anti-DEI, opposition to African-American studies, whatever you want to name here. And it can be really demoralizing. It can be discouraging. So part of what I wanted to do with this book is answer the question, how do you keep going when it looks like you're not winning? And by reading these stories of people who in the most egregious and oppressive of circumstances somehow tapped into the spirit of justice to continue to resist, we can gain hope, we can gain inspiration, and we can keep going too.
Amen. Amen. Yes. Tap into the spirit of justice and keep going, and keep going. And man, we have a long way to go, but we can get there. And it can be done together, and we can do it together.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
If you go back to your 21-year-old self, Jemar, what advice would you give?
Oh gosh. Woo. I had a lot not going on in. Anyway, if I go to my 21 years old and talk specifically about justice or
whatever you want to talk about, any advice you'd give to yourself at 21.
Pursue joy and justice. I had this idea that pursuing justice was always and only onerous. It was living life exclusively by the verse, take up your cross, follow me. And that cross has splinters and it's tearing up your back and it's heavy and you're struggling under its weight. And if you weren't, then you were doing something wrong in the Christian life. If you weren't struggling, if it didn't feel, in a sense, like misery, even doing the right thing, then you were doing it wrong. And what I would say to my younger self is, sure, it's going to be hard times when you truly feel the weight of that cross. But there are going to be joyful times too. And not only do you deserve that as a human being made in God's image, and that's what God wants for you, you need that. If you want to keep going in the struggle for justice, it can't all be doom and gloom. It can't all just be work and resisting and fighting. It's got to be enjoying and appreciating the journey along the way, and especially the people you encounter on that path. Those are the folks who bring joy. Those are the folks who serve as your community. Those are the folks who help recreate you during recreation, right? And that is good and beautiful and deserves your attention as well. You shouldn't feel guilty about enjoying this world and this life and this creation that God has given to all of us. And so those two, like footsteps, walk side by side, joy and justice.
So good. That's great. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you can recommend?
Oh gosh, reading. I only really get to read like books that I'm doing endorsements for. But some really fantastic books. I just met with Caleb Campbell, who wrote the book Disarming Leviathan, How to Talk to Your White Christian Nationalist Neighbor. I just interviewed Joel Goza, a colleague of mine at Simmons College, on his upcoming book, Rebirth of a Nation. I just did an endorsement for Angela Danker's book, Disciples of White Jesus, where she's talking about young white men and how they get sort of caught up in this Christian nationalism stuff. There's just so much great literature coming out these days. But for fun,
yeah,
I watch TV and I watch comedy, and my son and I are going back through Modern Family and watching all 11 seasons over. And that's right after we just finished all 11 seasons. So we're getting a lot of joy out of that. And I'm grilling because it's still summer for a couple more days. So that's fun.
Nice. Awesome. I love it. How can people connect with you? Go out, get your book, The Spirit of Justice. Where would you like to point people to?
Get the book wherever books are sold. Feel free to support local bookstores, Black-owned bookstores. Recommend it to your libraries. I would really, really appreciate it if you subscribe for free or paid to my Substack, jemartisby.substack.com. I call it a newsletter on steroids. You get articles from me direct to your inbox and all my latest thoughts. You don't have to wait a couple of years for the next book to come out. And I'm on all social media at Jemar Tisby.
Perfect. Well, Jemar, thank you so much for this conversation. It was fantastic to walk through a historical survey of Black people in the United States that embody the spirit of justice, that can fight for this place of lesser freedom into a place of greater freedom. And we can start to continue to move the needle, that we now don't have to be light switches, but we could be smoke detectors. And we could say, hey, what is going on? And we could embody the spirit of justice today.
Yes.
And we could continue on in the great tradition of Black Christians from the beginning of this country into today, of people standing up for the equitable treatment of all humans and saying that there are a place at the table for everybody. So thank you for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you for your thoughtful questions and actually letting me talk about the history in the book. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, You will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.